Amen. Well, tonight we continue our study as we look at the parables of Jesus. Tonight we're going to look at the parable of the weeds found in Matthew chapter 13. We're going to be in verses 24 through 30, as well as verse 36 through 43. Now this parable is very interesting. And before we jump into it, just kind of give you a little outline for tonight's lesson. This is going to be kind of the outline we use for the remainder of the parables. We're going to start off giving a little background information, because a lot of the stuff that Jesus was speaking about, people in his day and time would have known completely, at least how things worked, the stories that he told, because it addressed the things that were going on in their culture. So we'll do a little bit of a background each week, and then we'll look at the text, we'll give a little application, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So first and foremost, how many of you have ever wondered why it is that God allows evil in the world? Anyone ever wondered why it is that there's so much evil in the world? Some people have even asked this way, God is all powerful and God is all good. Well, why doesn't God do something about all this evil that's taking place? Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I've read this parable several times, but I've never really gone in depth with the way we're going into it tonight, because there are some incredible, great truths that Jesus presents to us in this parable. Jesus has overcome the world. A lot of times we'll ask, why is it that the world remains so depraved? Why is it that there are counterfeit versions of Christianity out there? Is there any hope that justice will ever come? Well, the wonderful thing about it is that this parable offers working answers to all those questions. This parable is far more powerful than I ever thought it was. I mean, because like I said, I've read it several times, but I've never really stopped and studied through it. And whenever I really stopped to dig through this parable, I thought, man, oh man, oh man, there's some great stuff in here. Absolutely fantastic stuff in here. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through. These are kind of some of the questions that are addressed through this parable. So first and foremost, we've got to travel back in time to this period, as people would have understood what Jesus was talking about, but sometimes it gets kind of lost in translation with us. Craig Keener writes that at this time, wealthy landowners controlled most of the rural land throughout the Roman Empire. Their estates were worked either by free peasants, in other words, tenant farmers, farmers who rented out the land from the one who owned it to work the land, or by slaves whose option in life were roughly the same, except that slaves could be beaten and sold, whereas the same was not true for free peasants. Most of the people listening to Jesus, or a great majority of them at least, would have been these people, these tenant farmers who were too poor to own the land themselves, but were working in the fields. Many of them may have even been slaves, but they were working in the fields, working these wheat fields, because wheat was itself one of the staples of that time. Bread was an absolute staple, and wheat was the preferred choice in making bread. Now, the other choice was barley. That was a lot cheaper, but wheat was preferred. There was a lot more money in wheat than there was in barley. Now, this is something that often gets lost in translation. We read about the parable of the wheat and tares, or the wheat and the weeds, but this gets lost in translation. The weed that Jesus is talking about is most likely one called the darnel plant, or the darnel weed. This is poisonous if you eat it. If you eat this weed, it will kill you. Plain and simple. So obviously it wasn't just about having the optimum crop. It was a matter of life or death. If you had these weeds mixed in with this wheat and you sold it to someone, it would kill your customers. And I'm no business expert, but if you kill all your customers, it don't look like your business is going to do too well. Amen? I think the supply and demand would definitely go off kilter. Obviously, the poisonous weed would be consumed by the landowners, would be consumed by the people who work the farm as well, and so this is a life or death situation. To make the problem even worse, when you first planted this darnel weed, which no one would really plant it unless they had ulterior motives, which we're going to look at, but this seed of this darnel weed looked identical to the seed of a wheat. The only way that you would really know the one from the other is let it grow. And as it matures and gets older, then you can begin to tell the difference. In fact, here are the pictures of the wheat and the weed. Now, when they're younger, they look a lot more similar. But as they get older, you can see this one's greener, more straight. This weed begins to branch out, becomes more of a tan or brown color, and becomes kind of scattered, you can tell there. But you really don't know it until it grows and matures. So this is the problem. These are the things that are associated with the parable that we're going to read tonight. So as we get started, let's take a look at this parable, and let's look first at verses 24 through 30 of Matthew chapter 13. And if someone will, read those verses for us. Matthew 13, verses 24 through 30.
Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in the field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came in and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the weeds sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go out and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let them grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it to my barn."
All right, this parable Jesus first demonstrates in verse 24 concerns the kingdom of heaven. So this is kind of the theme. It's something to do with the kingdom of heaven. So that's kind of a clue for us as we get started. So the parable continues. The kingdom of heaven will be the general theme. And so the kingdom of heaven is compared with this man or these farmers sowing good seed. Now the choice of the word good indicates a careful choice of the right seed for his purpose. So what that means is that these seeds were carefully chosen by the landowner, which makes it kind of odd that the servants would ask him, "Why did you plant these weeds in the field?" You know, they were kind of almost accusing the landowner of putting bad stuff in there when they had carefully looked through all these seeds and planted all these seeds at the landowner's command. Well, what was the landowner's response? What did the landowner say whenever they said, "You planted these seeds here"? What did he say?
He said that in the harvest time, then they would separate.
Absolutely. But who absolutely. Both what I was looking for. That wait till harvest time and that the enemy did it. He didn't do it, but the enemy did it. Now, as we go through this, keep this in mind as these explanations start coming out as to what these symbols represent. Keep that in mind because we do the same thing. Once these symbols start coming out, we do the same thing to God so often. Now, let's move through this. An enemy comes to plant this weed. So do you think that this enemy, whoever this enemy is, do you think that he really liked the landowner to plant a poisonous weed in his garden? Not too much. You guys ever remember, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s. You ever remember this Mr. Yuck commercial, the poison control? I saw that, I had to put it on there. What did that stand for? Anybody remember? Mr. Yuck? There's a little song that went with it. You don't want to sing it anyhow. Well, it represents something poisonous. Obviously this little face is going, stay away from it. They used to put this little logo on poisonous things to tell kids, stay away from it. It's not safe. Well, obviously these weeds were not safe to consume, and if they had this little logo back in those days, then obviously they would have wanted to put that on these type of weeds. Now, as the wheat began to grow, it became evident that weeds had been planted among the crop. Now again, they wouldn't have seen this initially because they looked identical when they first grew. As they started to grow and they started to mature, over time you would start to see distinctions between the wheat and the weed. Now, this took time in order for this to come about. So the servants again seem to accuse the landowner of planting these seeds. And if you look carefully at the way the landowner responds, he's like, I didn't plant these seeds. I didn't plant these weeds. What are you thinking? I'm not the one who planted these weeds. I'm not the one who planted this poisonous stuff. What are you accusing me of here? So it was not the intention of the landowner to have the weeds grow among the wheat. And again, that's something we need to remember. The servants wanted to take the weeds out as soon as they saw them. Now, if you're like me and you see a problem, what do you want to do? If you're like me, you want to be like Barney Fife and nip it in the bud. Take care of it right then and there. There's a problem, take care of it. But sometimes we see that that's not always the best answer. Okay? Because the problem here is that the darnel grew so close to the wheat and they were so similar that if they did it too soon, what would they do? Pull out the good. Absolutely. They'd pull out the good wheat in trying to destroy the weeds. So what they would eventually do is they would eventually destroy more good in the attempt of trying to take out the bad. All right, so there's several applications we can go with that as we come into our discussion. Therefore, the landowner tells them, just wait. Let them grow together, and as they mature and as the harvest time comes, we'll go through and we'll separate these. The weeds that are poisonous, we'll use it as fodder for the fire. That's what we're going to do. We'll throw it in the fire. And for the wheat, we'll place it in the storehouse. So in other words, he's almost speaking a word of comfort, saying, take it easy. It's okay. I've got this. When it comes time, we'll separate the good from the bad, and it'll all be good. All right, so with that in mind, let's take a look at the explanation given, and particularly look very closely at the first few verses, because Jesus does something different than he's done with the previous parables that we see. So starting in verse 36, someone read for us verses 36 through 43.
Then Jesus sent them all to the way, and went into the house, and his disciples came unto him, saying, declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field. He answered and said unto them, he that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, the good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the enemy. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear.
All right, going back in verse 42, I didn't add this to the study, but it needs to be, mentioned. The weeping and gnashing of teeth. Gnashing of teeth is almost like someone is grinding their teeth because there's just maybe so aggravated, so distressed. These are very intense illustrations we see here, weeping and gnashing of teeth, it's not a good place to be. So in other words, Jesus, what we find here in verse 36, he leaves the crowds. Where does he go? Where does the Bible tell us that he goes? In verse 36. Went into the house, and most likely this house was Simon Peter's, the one who he probably stayed with while in Capernaum. Okay, and his disciples, they come to him. Okay, so what Jesus does here is, if you were out in the crowd and you weren't one of the 12 disciples, talk about, now Grandma, she used to watch Days of Our Lives and all these soap operas, and it always tickled me because they knew how to write these things. They would have someone almost getting to the point of being killed or something, and they would say, to be continued, or something like that. Just leave you on edge. Well, Jesus, he wasn't given a soap opera, but he did kind of leave them in suspense, because for the general crowds, he gave the parable and said, okay, see ya. And everybody was left wondering, what does that mean? What does it mean? What does this parable mean? Well, obviously, he goes into the house, and these disciples, they're asking the same question. What does this mean? And so they finally get Jesus and say, now, Jesus, you've got to let us in on this. What in the world's going on here? What did that parable mean? And so then he begins to describe it. He gives us the key to this parable. Okay, he notes that the field represents the world. So in this parable, the field that he's discussing represents the world. Now, this doesn't represent the church. Some commentators will believe that it represents the church, but this, in fact, represents the entire world, the entire, all of humanity, since the beginning of humanity to the end of humanity. The field represents everyone. And so the good seeds represent the children of God. Those who are legitimately genuine in their faith respond and receive the gospel message. And the weeds, well, if the good seeds represents the children of God, what do the weeds represent? Evildoers, children of the devil, absolutely. Those who don't respond in faith to the gospel call. So, because again, remember, the theme is the kingdom of God. And so here this gospel message has been given out. There are those who respond, there are those who don't. Now remember, to understand the story, all of them look the same. You can't tell it from the outset. You can't tell it from as they begin to grow. You can't tell it from the outset, but as time goes on, we hear Jesus tells us that the evidence begins to come forth. The enemy is who? The devil, absolutely. And so what does the harvest here represent? Absolutely. Right. So the harvest is the end of time, and so the angels are the reapers coming to gather the good wheat, to cast away the bad. So let's just pause here, take a time out, take a mini discussion break here. Do you see any parallels here between Jesus' parable and the book of Revelation? From what when we study the book of Revelation, do you see any parallels in this parable? The bad's going to be weeded out in the end. Absolutely. You said it very well. It's absolutely. It's fruit. It's fruit. So you begin to see some answers coming out here. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
Pretty close to the final judgment.
Right.
The good and ways that are evil to know that will be brought.
Right.
Good will be living permanently. And
if you heard this, like I said, if you were one of the people just sitting there listening to this, and you hear this, your mind's got to be thinking, what did he mean by all that? You may be thinking, kind of going that direction, but Jesus really here, he leaves them in suspense, and then with the disciples, he comes and explains it. And don't you think, and to some degree, we've mentioned this before with John, he had to be thinking, wow, You know, he knew some of these things were coming about, but when he saw the full vision of Revelation, I mean, man, that had to be mind-boggling, you know, for him. Absolutely.
That's what it is. It shows you salvation and calling you beyond it, so it's judgment. And that's what Revelation shows. So that every one of these parables is the same thing. It shows that it leads towards salvation, it leads to salvation, and that's the good part. But if you don't listen to the parable and do what the parable says, that's the judgment. And that's the same thing in Revelation.
Proverbial double-edged sword, you know, and really that's the message in the entire Bible. You know, there's, as we're going to see, that there's really two options in eternity, you know, no middle ground there. So very well said. All right, so we're set up here. So in verses 40 through 43, in the end, Jesus explains that, as Stephen already said, the angels of God will rid the human race of all the causes of sin and evil. And this includes counterfeit religions. Because think about this for a moment. If you were the devil and you despised what God was doing and you despised the whole plan of salvation, you didn't want anybody to go to his heaven because you wanted God's kingdom for yourself, what are some of the things that you would do? Absolutely. Put some little, put the carrot before the, what is it? The carrot before the horse, yeah. Whew, I tell you, it's been a long day. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to put a hush. But anyhow, obviously, you know, you would put sprinkle some attractive things out there to lure people away. Absolutely. So Jesus explicitly teaches that those who are evil and are workers of evil will be cast into an eternal hell. Now, this isn't a pleasant thing to think about, but now let's just think about this. If we know that God is a just God and we see the things that are going on in the world today, understand, I believe that God gives us a choice to respond or to reject the call of salvation. And if you have someone who is wholeheartedly not going to listen, not going to receive, not going to turn around, what's the only other alternative that they have? If you're going to have a heaven, and you're going to have a heaven with no sin whatsoever, and you have someone who is bound to determine that they're not going to repent, not going to listen, what's the other alternative that you have? I don't think you have one. That's the only option that you have. So hell is a place that's chosen, really made for the devil and his own, and it's also used for those who reject Christ unto death. Hell is a place of judgment. Thus, all evil will pay the price. So we begin to find answers. We see a lot of evil in the world, but I think God is telling us, hang tight. I'm going to take care of this. In due time, hang tight is coming. You know, there's even allusions that we find here. But let me also say before we get to Daniel that the righteous of God will share in God's blessings for all eternity. So, as we've mentioned before in previous studies, for the Christian, this is the only hell that you'll ever experience. And for the unbeliever, this is the only heaven that you'll ever experience. So, for the believer, things are going to get a lot better, over time. For the unbeliever, well, unfortunately, that's not going to be the case. So you see, there's one big decision and two eternities. The prophet Daniel is referenced in this passage, and he says that those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever. Now understand, light often refers to God's perfect righteousness and glory. So if we are God's light, God has filled us with His love and of His mercy. We are instruments of His salvation. God's perfect righteousness and glory dwells within us. That doesn't mean that we're perfect. Lord knows I sin every day. I sin every day, and all of us do. But it just means that we have the righteousness of God imputed to us through the salvation that happens on the cross. So Jesus makes it clear that there are only two destinations in eternity: an eternity with God, which is heaven, which will be filled with all the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, goodness, kindness, patience, so on and so forth. And hell, which is a place without God, which is the exact opposite of the fruit of the Spirit. Okay, so these are the two options that a person has. By the way, I thought you might find this interesting. This house that was mentioned, there it is. Archaeologists, it's amazing to me how they're able to find these things. Archaeologists have actually discovered the very house of Simon Peter in Capernaum, and there's a picture of the house, and there's a kind of a diagram of the house plans down there below. So I just found that absolutely interesting, that when Jesus left the Sea of Galilee, he went in that place. That very picture that you see, he went in that house. Of course, it looked a lot better back in those days than it does now. So, let's take a look at some applications, and then we'll open this up for further discussion. We asked 2 or 3 questions, and I think we learned a lot of valuable lessons in this parable, lessons I haven't even seen before in studying this. The first question one may ask is, why is the world evil? Well, I think Jesus answers that. I think, first of all, we see God intended from the very beginning that the world would be good, and we find that in Genesis 1:31. When, after he had made everything, what did the Bible say that he said it was? It was good. Now, he said it was good. However, Satan, who wanted to be in the place of God, used human freedom against humanity to poison God's good creation. And if you're going to have perfect love, you have to have the ability, in my opinion, to respond to love. So God allowed evil to allow for, or permitted evil to allow for a greater good. I like the way Norman Geisler puts this. He says, in order to conquer evil, God had to first permit it. To permit evil in order to allow for a greater good. He had to create free creatures. These he created in 2 kinds. Angels, who are spirit creatures, and humans who have both a spirit and a body. So why is the world evil? Well, God didn't want it to be, but permitted it to be so that a greater good, a greater love can come from it in the end. And I've used this illustration before. Ladies, how many of you have ever had someone come to you and say, maybe in high school, say, honey, would you go on a date with me? And you said, I want absolutely nothing to do with that character. Anybody ever had that happen? I don't want anything to do with that character. What if that person kept pushing and pushing and pushing? Well, then obviously you keep pushing away, because that's not love. But now your husband's here. He asked you, honey, would you like to go out with me? And I think we see the answer that you gave, because you're married to them. You said yes. Now I see some head shaking. Let's not go there. But obviously love was freely given and love was freely received. You have to have that in order to have true, genuine love. So that's the answer. At least I think that's the answer. At least I think in a good part that God allowed it to allow in the end for a greater good to take place. The second question is, why doesn't God just take care of evil now? I mean, why doesn't he just put his foot down and just take care of all of it? Well, the response is, when God fully steps into the scene, Peter writes that the world would be burned up and dissolved. There's a reason you can't see God in his full glory right now. Because if you did, you couldn't take it. It's for your protection that you can't see God in his full glory right now. Because when God steps on the scene and he takes care of business, there's no turning back. Okay? So what this tells us is that there are more wheat to be harvested. There are more souls to be saved. And when that time comes, and God in his grace and his infinite knowledge knows when that time will happen, when the last soul is saved, then he's going to tell his son Jesus, go get my children and bring them home. Let's wrap this thing up. And then he'll take care of it. God hasn't acted yet because there are still more souls to be harvested and saved in the end. Now, last question. Will evil be judged? 2 responses. 1, absolutely yes. And in fact, I would tell you, friends, the more I think about this, that if there was not a God, this life would be a most miserable existence. Because what that means is that all the evil that's going on in the world today would never see judgment whatsoever. And let's just think about this. A lot of times, we have a police officer here, and he's able to work to catch a lot of people. Let's be honest, there's a lot of people who go scot-free. Not because of him, but because of, just because of circumstances. There's a lot of times people get off scot-free. Well, if this world didn't have a judge over it, that would be a most miserable thing. That would mean that Adolf Hitler, all the things that he did, he'd just get off scot-free with no judgment whatsoever. But because the fact that there is a God means that there's perfect love, but it also means that there's perfect judgment in the end. So the parable of Jesus gives us assurance that in the end, evil will be conquered. And then the second response is going back to Norman Geisler. He says the nature of God demands that evil will be overcome because, one, God is all-loving and wants to defeat evil. Number two, God is all-powerful and can defeat evil. Number three, evil is not yet defeated. And number four, hence, evil will be defeated in the future. So rest tight. I think that's what Jesus is telling us. And I think this is very appropriate in God's timing. I think this is absolutely appropriate that we study this tonight. In the end, God is going to judge evil. And you know what? In the end, He wins. And so that's the great hope that we have in Christ Jesus. So let's take a look at some discussions. These are just starter questions. We can go with however you want to go with this. What's the overall message, in your opinion, of the parable of the weeds? What do we learn about the nature of God in this parable? And what are some ways that we can continue to trust in God while living in such an evil world that we do? So let's just open it up for discussion.
First thing is you have to let people know and feel and see what that person is.
Amen. That's very well said.
Who's evil and who's not.
That's right. And that's well said because even in the end, the person has up to the point of death. And even in those last few moments, there's always that opportunity that someone can be transformed, even if there's just a glimmer of hope left in that person. So that's very well said.
That's basically the same thing that we see throughout the Bible with different things. It just says, people are good, but we're going to allow you to have sin in your life, that you've got to turn your life over to Jesus to be able to live in the direction.
Right. Absolutely.
And that story that we have these two, and my school had, it's called Johnson Days. And my dad would make us go out and field and dig Johnson Days, and do that, because it was some other stuff that we had gone on weeds. And so the story was told that this young guy worked for this farmer, and he was in love with the farmer's daughter, but the farmer didn't want him to marry her, so he fired him. He said the boy went out and got a branch called Johnson Weed Seeds and brought it out and set it all over the farmer's land. And he wound up marrying farmer's daughter and inherited that land. So, there's always going to be the evil one, always going to be our certain seeds. And so we better watch out.
That's right.
Because we inherit that and stuff.
That's a very good point.
Some of y'all know what Johnson is.
Once you get back into those days, the farmers that was basically the livelihood of the world at that time. And if you had weeds and they took over the crops and all, then you couldn't produce food. So that was a big thing. Jesus said, for people to listen with their ears and see with their eyes, and that was another thing. If you didn't have vision and you didn't have hearing, your livelihood probably was not going to be very very great back in that time, so that's pretty much with the livelihood of the girls and the way I understand.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can think about fishing, there's one thing to fish just for fun, but this is these guys' livelihood. So when you read stories about how they were out there all day and couldn't catch any fish, I mean, that wasn't just troubling for the fact that they were frustrated. I mean, that was a financial hit they were taking because they couldn't get fish, and the same thing applies here with the weeds. So I think you hit the nail on the head with that. That's right.
Being such a staple back in the day, it was actually illegal to plant this weed in another person's field.
Oh, yeah.
So basically the law says, don't sow your evil here, as is God's law that says, don't sow your evil here.
Right.
But regardless, people like in that time, of course, didn't obey the law, just like Satan doesn't obey the law. But it doesn't mean that in the end, we can't tell the good and the bad about future later. Regardless, in the end, there will be judgment.
And I like the way you put that. A lot of people have problems when you talk about the judgment of God. But really, if there wasn't any judgment, that would mean a lot of stuff goes unpunished. Very evil stuff. And I don't have to tell you guys about it because you open the newspaper and look online and you see it, happening all the time. Exactly. There'd be no end to it. That's right.
I think the parable, since it parallels so closely to Revelation, that it continues to give hope to everybody that this is the Word of God. In parallel. And he reinforces it over and over and over again.
So my dad would go out and he went sprinted drops of grass. He would freeze and literally, wipe out anything that could grow for several years. There was probably a friend like him because he knew the roots were way out. And he would just sterilize that area. But there was nothing to grow from that. So he had to really be unsterilized before anything. And then he went up in his probably the very early 70s. It was very awesome. But I didn't even wish this was very awesome, but they don't drops of grace. I thought it was an awesome guy, but at least they got it on. It wasn't awesome guys. I thought that's what it was. But I knew you couldn't plant. You really had to, that's why we had to go through it. And when we did, because we couldn't cut them all down, because of the road that we were taking out of it, we tried to do what we did in the crop, it would be exactly what the Bible says, and we pull the crop up too. We want to plant, so it's very similar, we have our own needs.
That's right.
And you could not pull it, so you couldn't have bigger than that.
You got any more of that root, the people use in the field on that wood, no matter how small.
And that's not even, it's not, it's just what's on heart. We used to say people are mean, but now that it's not just meanness, they're evil. And they're not doing it, they're not doing things,
Well, I think it's what the Bible, it tells us that, each of us are made in the image of God. So there's something special about every person. But the Bible also tells us that sin is like that weed. It's like that poison that once it wraps around someone, it begins infecting them. And if you don't have the cure, the Son of Christ and His salvation, then it's just going to overtake you, completely. And I think the illustrations you guys used of the weeds taking over, I think is a perfect example of the illustration we find of sin, in the Bible.
Well, this parable that he gave us, Jesus was mainly talking to the people that are the Pharisees, because they were, I think, wasn't that really a law that was referring to the evil one, is Satan, that we know how they treated him and how they tried to destroy him.
Well, I would say that they would probably be more like the weeds, like the sons of the evil one, like standing opposed to the work of God. So,
Because when you read the Bible, the Pharisees were, they did everything they could to destroy the Son of Man.
yeah.
It's pretty sure about the rules. And some men didn't know about rules. Because he was being ruled.
There's actually something interesting historically going on with that, because actually Jesus got in a lot of arguments with the Pharisees, but it was actually the Sadducees who got him killed. And here's the reason why. The Pharisees were more of the common religious scholars of the time. And they had disagreements with Jesus. But the Sadducees were Roman sympathizers, and actually they weren't even supposed to have the priesthood. What happened is when Rome came into Jerusalem, they cast out the priests, and many people believed it was this group called the Essenes who held the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, they become monks. Well, anyhow, the Sadducees bought the priesthood from the Romans, so they were in tight. They were more of a political group than they were a religious group, really. And when Jesus started saying things like, tear this temple down and in 3 days I'll build it back, saying that the temple is not the focus, what they started thinking is, this is going to start affecting us financially. So once he started affecting the power structure of the Sadducees, especially the money, that's when they say, we need to send this guy over and have something done to him, because this is getting serious. He's going to cause us a lot of trouble. So it was the Pharisees. They were obviously against Jesus, but it was the Sadducees' power and the connections they had with Rome. That's what really led into the crucifixion. But yeah, they had a lot to do with that.
Well, there's something I think that's a good discussion of why Jesus started doing that. Because all I thought that was good.
Yeah, we were talking some about that, I think, about how,
Why we changed from one way of teaching to another.
right.
Which usually things that they all knew about. And that teaching you this is what you do if you want to go to heaven, and then you don't do what you do damnation.
Right.
But it seems like they're always,
Let me back up and say the Pharisees weren't innocent by any means, because they were part of the Sanhedrin, which was mainly ruled by Sadducees, but they were part of it too. So if Pharisees had trouble, they could get the Sadducees in on it, and then they would have a coup against Jesus to take care of the problem. So it was really the Sadducees who signed off, but it was the Pharisees. Some Pharisees were obviously well against Jesus too. So it's very complicated socially during that time.
We're talking about Munson Grace, and because they were actually developed for erosion control, and they were developed by the government to go along with the highway department back in, probably it was, I was real small, probably it was back in mid to late 40s, when they come along and started, the highway department started showing both of the plan, legislators and also Johnson Grace for erosion control.
I know kids who look around mom and dad's house, it is something else.
Well, the thing about Pedro is the cows over here in North, one's over here, one's pushing.
Really? I didn't know
So
that.
I figured it would be a self-control issue that would help fight, but the ones here won't touch it, the ones in there will eat it like that.
Can we get some English cow? All right, so next week we're going to back up a little bit and look, and this is a very short parable, It's the parable of the mustard seed and the leaven. And he doesn't give the description of these things, so what we'll have to do is read the parable and have to kind of go back and look and see what these different symbols stand for. And then coming up after that, we have 3 parables that are very short in verses 44 through 49. So we'll handle all 3 of those during one lesson. Any other questions or comments before we close? If not, David, would you mind closing us with a word of prayer?
Yeah.